Ash and darkness rolled across the Bay of Naples, as though the sea itself had been swallowed by smoke. At midday the sun disappeared. People staggered through streets that had been bright moments before, arms raised against a rain of pumice that struck skin like thrown stone. Roofs groaned under the growing weight, then gave way in sudden, crushing collapses. Mothers pressed cloths to their children's mouths, not as comfort, but as a last method of keeping air moving. The world narrowed to breath, heat, grit, and the sound of a mountain breaking open. Far away, in Rome, the first messages arrived confused, rushed, and incomplete. A volcano had erupted. Towns along the coast were vanishing under ash and debris. The imperial court, built to manage petitions, appointments, and ceremonial order, found itself facing an event that did not negotiate. In the palace, power was supposed to be distance marble, law, protocol, the controlled rhythm of governance. Yet disaster did not respect distance. It demanded presence, resources, and decisions made before certainty was possible. The ruler who received those messages was not remembered for conquest alone, nor for theatrical cruelty, nor for the long intimidation that had marked other reigns. His time on the throne was brief, so brief it later seemed like an interval between harsher seasons, but brevity did not mean simplicity. The same man associated with clemency as emperor had earlier directed a provincial campaign whose human and material cost helped finance Rome's monuments and secure a new dynasty. His reputation contained friction, restraint in the capital, severity on the frontiers, tenderness in catastrophe, hardness in siege. His name was Titus. Later, the Senate called him the delight of the human race. The phrase did not erase what came before him, and it did not make him harmless. It revealed what Rome craved after upheaval, a sovereign who could be obeyed without constant dread, who could command without endlessly threatening. That image of a ruler revealed, not only by triumphal processions, but by how he moved when the world collapsed into ash, became the hinge on which his memory turned. The Rome that formed Titus still lived with the bruises of civil conflict. In the year he was born, the empire's borders held, its armies marched, and its officials collected taxes across provinces that ringed the Mediterranean like a clasped hand. But the hand trembled. The republic was long dead, replaced by monarchy that preserved old titles while stripping old power. Emperors spoke of partnership with the Senate while ruling through appointments, patronage, and coercion. Informers turned private speech into public danger. Exile and severe legal penalties waited behind formal procedures. Rome's culture praised discipline and ancestry. Yet the empire had outgrown the old simplicity it celebrated. In the capital, marble temples and aristocratic villas stood within shouting distance of crowded tenements. The city ran on rumor and spectacle, on patronage and performances of loyalty. Far from Rome, the provinces felt empire as paperwork, taxation, governors, and, when necessary, legionary enforcement. Peace was Rome's boast, but it was often the shadow cast by force. For most people in the capital, life was narrow and unstable. They were laborers, shopkeepers, freedmen, porters, and the enslaved, living among insulae where fire and collapse were constant threats. Rents could devour wages. An unskilled worker earned a few sestertii a day when work appeared. A soldier's pay was steadier but far from luxurious once deductions and daily costs were counted. Bread measured security more accurately than slogans. First-century price evidence was fragmentary and shifted by season and supply, but the core reality was unmistakable. When grain shipments faltered, anxiety hardened into anger. The grain dole was not charity, it was the empire's pulse, and rulers who disrupted it risked unrest that no speech could calm. Into this world rose the Flavians, ambitious by Roman standards and upstarts by aristocratic myth. They did not possess the antique pedigree Rome loved to recite over the dead. They possessed something more practical in a dangerous century: competence, useful alliances, and a deep understanding of how power truly worked through the army. When Titus later inherited the throne, he did not inherit calm. He inherited a city that remembered Nero, the collapse after Nero, and the brutal scramble that followed. Rome had learned how quickly an emperor could be unmade. That knowledge lingered over the palace like smoke that, in Titus's reign, would be answered by a darker cloud rising from Vesuvius. Titus Flavius Vespasianus was born in 39 CE. In childhood he stood close enough to the machinery of influence to be shaped by it. yet far enough from old nobility to feel the insecurity of newcomers. His father, Vespasian, would become emperor, but in Titus's early years that destiny was not guaranteed. The Flavians advanced through service, discipline, and the slow accumulation of credibility, qualities that won soldiers and administrators more readily than they won aristocratic admiration. Education for Titus was not decoration, it was equipment. He learned rhetoric, the expectations of public performance, and the habits of command. He also learned, early, how thin the line was between favor and danger. He spent time at court in his youth, close to the Julio-Claudian household. Ancient tradition held that he was raised alongside Britannicus, the son of Claudius, later removed from power under Nero. Whether the intimacy was exactly as later writers portrayed it remained debated. The political lesson, however, did not depend on perfect detail. In Rome, proximity to power was not safety, it was exposure. Compared to the average Roman, Titus lived in a different world. While families in the insulae measured their week in coins and loaves, Titus belonged to the narrow class that could, by continuity, tutors, leisure for study, early military commissions, connections that turned obstacles into doors. Yet privilege did not guarantee survival. In imperial Rome, status was a stage, and the trapdoor sometimes opened without warning. The young Flavian learned to read rooms, to please without appearing pliant, to be decisive without inviting charges of recklessness. These were not virtues of comfort. They were skills of survival. What distinguished Titus, even before he held authority, was adaptability. He did not drift through luxury as though it were permanent. He was shaped by a father who understood that the empire's real constitution was written in camps, paid in donatives, and marched on roads. Titus learned that rule was a performance backed by organized force, and that the two could not be separated for long. By the time he reached adulthood, the empire was moving toward one of its most violent transitions. Titus was positioned not merely to witness it, but to be used by Iton to use it in return. Opportunity arrived in armor. Rome's frontiers demanded constant attention, and the military offered the fastest route to reputation. Titus served as a tribune in Britain and in Germany, learning the empire's edges where authority was not marble but mud, cold discipline, and relentless logistics. Those postings taught him the language of the legions, the only language that could raise a family beyond the contempt of older houses. His true ascent began in Judea in 66 CE, a province long strained by taxation, local grievances, and the abrasive presence of Roman administration erupted in revolt. Nero sent Vespasian to suppress it, and Titus went with him. Father and son waged a campaign that hardened them into the kind of men Rome rewarded. Town after town was taken. Resistance was met with exemplary punishment. Roman order was restored in the manner Rome considered normal, and those on the receiving end remembered it as catastrophe. Then Rome itself cracked. In 68 CE, Nero fell, and the empire entered the year of the four emperors Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each elevated and discarded by soldiers. Legitimacy became a commodity minted in camps and spent in the forum. In those months, Titus's position sharpened. He was no longer only a young commander. He became an instrument of dynastic survival. He moved among Eastern commanders and client rulers, including Agrippa II. He entered a relationship with Bernice, a Jewish princess whose presence later scandalized Rome, where memories of Cleopatra still poisoned any hint of an Eastern queen beside a Roman ruler. Even private attachments became political liabilities. When Jerusalem fell in 70 CE, after a harsh, protracted siege led by Titus, the victory was both military and symbolic. The plunder was immense, and the temple's treasures, later carved in relief on the Arch of Titus, became trophies turned into policy. The spoils helped reward soldiers, stabilize the new regime, and fund building projects that announced Flavian permanence. The wealth could not be separated from the destruction that produced it. It did not arrive as a neutral resource. It arrived as conquest converted into cash and stone. Back in Rome, Titus's authority tightened further when he became prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the force stationed closest to the emperor, and already proven capable of making and unmaking rulers within the city's walls. Ancient sources suggested that, in this role, he relied on informers and acted firmly against perceived threats. In an era shaped by coups and rapid succession, firmness was often treated as vigilance. Yet it also fed fear that Titus, once enthroned, might continue the methods associated with earlier reigns. Rome had learned to distrust heirs who began as protectors and ended as predators. When Vespasian secured the throne and restored order after chaos, Titus stood at the center of the new regime, heir general, guardian of the palace, partner in administration. He carried both triumph and suspicion. The same hands that had directed a siege now controlled the guard. The same man celebrated in public ceremony could be accused, if the mood turned, of aspiring to tyranny. By the late 70s, the question was no longer whether Titus would reach the summit. It was what kind of ruler he would become once he carried the entire weight of Rome alone. Titus became emperor in 79 CE. He inherited a state weary of intimidation and hungry for stability. Vespasian had rebuilt the treasury and restored discipline, but the Flavian dynasty still needed more than solvency. It required legitimacy that felt real to the city, visible grandeur, competent administration, and the sense that Rome's gods had not turned away. One of Titus's defining acts was to complete and inaugurate the Flavian Amphitheatre, later called the Colosseum. The building itself was a political statement. Its stones rose where Nero had claimed space for a private lake and a golden fantasy. The Flavians offered a public monument in its place, transforming a symbol of imperial indulgence into a symbol of imperial gift. The amphitheatre was not only entertainment, it was architecture as ideology, an announcement that the ruler could turn confiscated luxury into shared spectacle. The inaugural games were vast, staged over many days, a flood of pageantry and controlled violence. They were meant to persuade Rome that a new era had begun and that the dynasty deserved gratitude. Yet the very scale of the spectacle carried its own unease. The arena demonstrated authority through contests that often ended fatally, and it trained the crowd to expect extraordinary offerings from the throne. It soothed today and sharpened tomorrow's hunger. Then the empire faced a test no amphitheatre could distract from. In 79 CE Vesuvius erupted, overwhelming Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other settlements. Ancient writers describe darkness at noon, an ash that entombed streets and homes with terrifying speed. The catastrophe carried religious dread as well as physical ruin. It felt like nature itself had turned against Rome's ordered world. Titus responded by appointing officials to oversee relief and reconstruction, and by funding aid from the imperial treasury. The surviving record preserved less administrative detail than the eruption's scale, but the political meaning remained clear. An emperor was expected to act as the state's father. In calamity, absence could be read as indifference, and indifference could fracture loyalty as surely as defeat. Before the empire could recover its balance, Rome itself suffered. In 80 CE, a great fire broke out, devastating large parts of the city. It tore through neighborhoods where the poor lived packed tight, and where a spark could become an advancing front of flame. Disease followed, often described as plague in ancient sources, though the precise nature remained uncertain, deepening the sense that fate had singled out the rain. The city that depended on grain fleets and crowded tenements now faced fear that spread faster than decrees. Titus again answered with generosity, funds for rebuilding, support for those harmed, an effort to appear present rather than distant. Generosity, however, carried its own costs. Relief strained resources, reconstruction required competent administrators, public giving raised expectations that later emperors might resent or fail to meet. Even the best-intended aid could become a political trap if people came to believe the throne owed miracles. Still, in these years Titus crafted something that war and spectacle alone could not provide, a reputation for restraint and power. He avoided, according to ancient writers, the sensational treason prosecutions that had stained earlier reigns. He spoke of the Senate with unusual respect, keeping alive the old fiction of partnership and performing it as if it mattered. For senators who remembered humiliation under previous emperors, this tone had real force. It did not restore the republic, but it eased the daily dread of arbitrary accusation. That restraint did not end conflict. It shifted it into quieter channels. In Rome, opposition rarely marched openly unless the army chose to follow. It moved through patronage, whispers, guarded letters, and the control of information. Titus had once commanded the Praetorian Guard. He understood how quickly a rumor could become a charge, and how quickly a charge could become a sentence. Yet he also understood that visible terror could rot legitimacy from within. A ruler who relied only on fear might endure, but he rarely inspired loyalty that lasted. Ancient sources reported at least one serious plot against Titus. though the details varied. Conspiracies in Rome were sometimes real and sometimes inflated by the anxieties of the moment or the agendas of later writers. Titus's response was remembered as measured punishment without a sweeping purge, discipline without a descent into suspicion that consumed the elite. Such moderation strengthened his public image, but it also carried risk. In a political culture trained to equate power with ruthlessness, mercy could be misread as weakness. Beyond the palace, the common people continued to live with pressures that imperial virtue could not dissolve. Fires disrupted work, disease haunted streets and tenements. Even when the emperor provided aid, daily life remained a calculation made one coin at a time. Prices rose in panic. Bread remained the hinge of survival, and Rome's stability depended on systems that were always vulnerable. Grain fleets crossing seas, warehouses exposed to fire, and a city too large to feed itself without constant imperial attention. The most delicate tension lay within the dynasty itself. Domitian, Titus's younger brother, lived in the shadow of a ruler praised for warmth and restraint. Domitian was intelligent and ambitious, and the court watched him the way Rome always watched possible successors, with curiosity, fear, and a readiness to assign motives to silence. Titus had no surviving legitimate son to anchor succession. That fact turned every illness into a political event and every delay into suspicion. Rome had learned, through repeated crises, what uncertainty of succession could unleash. The machinery of power did not wait politely for grief. After ash, fire, and disease, Titus's reign began to feel like a struggle against a tide that refused to turn. Ancient authors depicted him as working continuously, responding to calamity with action, giving until giving itself became exhaustion. His strength, which had looked effortless in triumph, now appeared as endurance. In 81 CE, Titus fell ill. The details were sparse and quickly entangled with rumor, as they often were when the prize was the throne. He traveled to the Sabine country, near Aquicutilia, where his father had died. There his condition worsened. He was around 41 years old, an age at which emperors could still imagine decades reforms, campaigns, carefully prepared succession. Instead, the reign ended abruptly, like a torch put out by wind. His death altered momentum, not only because it removed a ruler, but because it removed a developing expectation. Titus had helped secure Flavian legitimacy through victory in Judea and through visible command of Rome's military power. As emperor, he offered a model at least in the memory preserved by ancient writers of restraint, conciliation, and generosity in disaster. That image did not have time to be fully tested. His sudden death created a vacuum not of office but of belief. Rome had begun to trust the idea of a benevolent emperor, and trust, once awakened, became a standard that later rulers could fail. Rumors gathered quickly around Domitian. Later sources, hostile to Domitian's character and reign, sometimes implied deliberate wrongdoing, yet the evidence remained inconclusive. After a period marked by fire, disease, and relentless strain, illness offered a plausible explanation, and Rome was no stranger to emperors dying of fever. The motive attributed by rumor was simple: the throne. What could be said with certainty was limited and stark. Titus died. Domitian succeeded him immediately, with a speed that suggested the machinery of succession had been poised to move the moment it was allowed. Titus's body returned to Rome, and with it came a quiet that followed brief relief, the silence after a ruler who had been praised. When people realized they were about to learn what praise had brought them, the city that had spoken warmly of Titus now faced an emperor of a different temperament. Memory began, almost at once, to harden into comparison. The legacy of Titus settled into paradox, carved into Rome's stone. His name became bound to the Colosseum, the empire's most famous theatre of public spectacle and regulated violence. It became bound as well to the Arch of Titus, where reliefs depicted soldiers carrying the spoils of the Jerusalem temple in triumph. For some, the arch stood as a symbol of imperial grandeur and victory. For others, it remained a monument to loss, displacement, and the brutal certainty of conquest. Titus's remembered mercy could not erase the Judean War, because that war financed the very public generosity that later writers praised. Within Roman political memory, however, Titus became something rarer than competence. He became the emperor who supposedly did not need to be feared. Suetonius and Cassius Dio portrayed him as unexpectedly mild once he became ruler, even while admitting many had expected a second Nero. Whether this reflected a genuine moral transformation, political calculation, or simply the difference between the necessities of frontier war and the duties of civil governance, remained a matter of interpretation. The sources were written later and carried their own biases. The reign was too short to answer every question it raised. Historians therefore debated the depth and durability of Titus's virtues. A longer reign might have forced him to choose between moderation and survival under prolonged revolt or sustained elite opposition. It might have exposed the corrosions that absolute power often produced. Instead, the record preserved an image sharpened by catastrophe, a ruler who responded as Rome wanted an emperor to respond, spending money and attention to keep the world from seeming abandoned. That image mattered because it offered Rome, briefly, a different relationship to sovereignty. Strength could be demonstrated not only by domination, but by the ability to absorb disaster without indifference. Titus's reign did not reshape the empire's foundations, and it remained inseparable from conquest. Yet it suggested, for a moment, that imperial authority could be used to shield, as well as to punish. In the end, his brevity became part of the legend. A long reign accumulated enemies, compromises, and fatigue. A short reign could be remembered in ideal light, its shadows visible but not yet overwhelming. What followed under Domitian made the contrast sharper, and contrast hardened affection into longing. In Rome, the dead were honored with rites and with stories. Titus became one of those stories, the conqueror who could be described as weeping, the emperor who gave, the ruler whose hand opened when calamity closed around the state. His name endured between the Colosseum and the Arch, between spectacle and spoils, between public gift and provincial ruin. Forever between the glory of empire and the price of its victories. Ash fell on Pompeii like a grey tide, sealing voices in silence. Fire swept Rome and left blackened streets where ordinary life had stood only days before. In such moments, titles meant less than action. An emperor's character became visible not in ceremony, but in response. How quickly help arrived, how openly suffering was acknowledged, how much of the treasury was treated as the state's lifeblood, rather than the ruler's prize. Titus had commanded legions and witnessed the final devastation of Jerusalem. He had known the intoxication of triumph and the dangerous theater of court politics. Yet the image that endured was of a ruler who, when the earth and the city seemed determined to break, answered with presence and expenditure rather than distance. His reign remained too short to prove what he might have become, and too entangled with conquest to satisfy any single moral reading. Still, by the standard Rome understood with unsparing clarity whether the emperor acted as guardian rather than predator. Titus left a mark that outlived his 2 years. That was why his story lingered, not because it was pure, but because it held contradiction. A man formed by war who governed briefly, as though clemency could function as strength. History often granted its warmest praise to rulers who did not always have time to grow old, and Titus, ending before his portrait could fully darken, remained a flame remembered against the ash.